Great. So today we're going to be looking at a overview of the new Blocks API and what that means for Contensis moving forward. We've got today myself, Richard Chivers. I'm going to be taking you through from the perspective of, I guess, a web manager in the demo we're doing. John is going to be taking us through development of a small Node.js app, and he's going to be using Liquid templates to render some HTML. And Simon's going to be taking us through building a small news app using .NET Core. So we're all each going to be looking at a slightly different aspect. But I'm going to start by just giving you some background into what the takeaways are, I guess, from today and what we'll be covering in general. And the first thing is a general look at the UI. So what we can do in the UI, what's there, and what's possible. We'll be looking at gaining an understanding of CI, which is continuous integration, and how it fits into the block workflow. And just to very quickly explain that, continuous integration is where we commit code, that code then causes an action to happen, typically test those sorts of things later. So continuous integration is typically used in most modern web development workflows. So we're just showing how that fits into the world of blocks and what we can do with that. We're going to learn how we can integrate UI tests into development workflow. And for anyone who's practicing continuous integration, it's typically I mean, we've been practicing continuous integration for many years at Zengenti in our core development team for Contensis. But for anyone who's practicing it, often the utopia or the place you want to get to is also continuous delivery. And continuous delivery is where we can commit code, we can test the code, and then we can put it live straight away. Now, most people don't get to that point. Most people have some sort of human gatekeeper to finally release some code. But you can, if you want to, practice continuous delivery as well with the new Blocks API, Blocks workflow, etc. But these UI tests become increasingly important because without having full UI test coverage, there's no way any of us would want to just release code out there to our public end users. So these are really important if you want to get to that sort of place. Finally, we're going to be looking at how we can manage and release changes safely, even if you're not a developer. So one of the things about blocks to consider is that we have looked to sort of separate this need of developers always being involved in the actual release process of the code. So they get the code ready, they put it into a good position, and then whoever's working on the site itself can then choose when and how they want to release things out to their live users. So it sort of changes the dynamic a little bit from what you're used to, takes away some of those sort of bottlenecks that can occur as well. So in terms of a block, because you may all be asking, what is a block? So fundamentally, a block, I suppose, boils down to a Docker container. And you probably don't need to really know much about Docker containers. And it's fair to say that we've got a professional services team with 20 or 30 people in it. Out of all of those people probably know what a Docker container is, but they wouldn't necessarily know about it in detail. But it's a thing that's there under the bonnet that ultimately makes blocks possible. And a Docker container basically is a way of packaging up code. It has to really run on a Linux operating system. And it's very standard throughout the industry in terms of how we package up and deliver applications today. So a block is a Docker container underneath the bonnet, so to speak. But on top of that, we have configuration, which tells us what we want to do with that block and how we want it to be interpreted and those sorts of things as well. Typically, though, as you'll find with most things we do, the idea is convention over configuration. So in the examples today, even though there is lots of configuration available, we have manifests that you can put into sorts of other things. we won't be needing to do that because the default will work perfectly well from the get-go. So it's a Docker container, and the other thing to say about it is it has versions. So every time you choose to push your block to the Contensis blocks API, we will increment a version number on your behalf so that you can manage those versions through the Contensis user interface. So, you know, we have here somebody on version 1 pushes one change, version 2 is the next change, version 3 is the next change. You could, for example, have all sorts of branching strategies, all sorts of other things, and only push to us particular branches. There's lots of scope for really working however you want to. But from a Contensis point of view, whenever we get a new one, we give it a version number and allocate it that way. So we always know what we're dealing with. If we've got versions, of course, what we can also do is we can roll these blocks backward and forward pretty much at our will. So if we worked on version 1 and we just released version 2, which is now our live block, for example, released and made live version 2, and we noticed a problem, then in a second we can just mark it as broken and roll back to version 1. So unlike perhaps your traditional scenario where it's often quite difficult to roll back changes that affect lots of content in a big web architecture or similar, here we can with pinpoint precision roll back entire sets of changes in literally seconds, and we'll be showing that in the presentation a little bit later on. So we've talked a little bit now about what is a block, but the next question is really about what can a block do, and what sort of things would you expect from it. So the first thing it can be is it can be a web component. So this is probably going to be the most common type of block, and ultimately it returns HTML to a browser. That could be a full HTML page, it could be a fragment of HTML, but ultimately it would return some HTML, perhaps CSS, and those sorts of things to a browser to typically render a page or part of a page. And it will be typically making some API calls off to a system, typically perhaps the Contensis delivery API, but also other APIs if it wanted to as well. So a web component is probably the sort of the main use case in that sense, in terms of the most frequently used we expect. Because it's a Docker container, you can now write these in any language whatsoever. So if you want to use any templating language you choose, as long as it can ultimately run on Linux, which is almost everything, Golang, PHP, Python, .NET, you know, whatever it might be that you want to develop in, then you can work and deliver templates, use whatever framework you want and all those sorts of things as well. We're just going to show you some of that today. The other thing it can be is it can be a service or an API. So if we think back to most people that may have signed up for the webinar today, then when they signed up using a form, we had a webhook fire, and when that webhook fired, it called a service behind the scenes, and that service integrated with MailChimp and put you on a mailing list so that after we've uploaded the webinar later on in the week, you'll get an email about that, for example. So in this particular case, it's a web component in a sense, as in it's running on HTTP on a URL, but it's there really to service the needs, in our case, of a webhooks endpoint or something like that, or an API. It's not customer facing, so to speak, but you can host really any HTTP application in a block inside your Contensis site now. And again, you can write that in any language with any preference that you choose. The final sort of use case, I guess, is, and I'm sure we'll probably come up with others as well, but the final main use case is a job. And here we've said, you know, it does something like importing data. So many of our customers have third-party systems, and yeah, a good example might be They might have a HR or a job system, and once an hour we can go off and collect the latest jobs from that system, push them into a content type and entry, and that will then get published on your website. And from a developer point of view, all your content's in one place. You've got to worry about things in one scenario, so it's easy to do, but it can really do anything you want. So it boots, it doesn't necessarily listen to HTTP, but it does something in the background to help your web estate. Another fun example that you could think of is maybe you'd sit there and listen to the Twitter API, and every time someone tweets on your account, it could be sat there streaming, you could add a content type and entry, or add an entry to Contensis for the latest tweet, and that way people could perhaps allocate news items or categorize news against tweets or whatever you might want to do. So it's something that's running in the background. In the long term, we intend to make these schedulable. So you will be able to actually schedule them to start and then stop. But for the moment, if you wanted to do that, they start and continually run, and you'd have to put that functionality in yourself. So we've talked about what they are and what they're used for and those sorts of things. So without further ado, I think we should get on and have a look at building one of these blocks. We're going to take some really simple examples of how to do that today. But before we actually go into it, I just thought I would explain the process we're going to cover before we look at it in detail. So ultimately, we're going to commit some code to a source control system. In our case, I think we're using a mixture today of GitLab and GitHub. We're then going to build a Docker container. We're going to test it using, in this case, Cypress, which is a really nice testing tool that we can use. And then we're going to push it to Contensis using the Contensis CLI. And ultimately then we're going to look at how we can make those blocks available to render components and all those sorts of things. So if I can hand over to you now, John, and take us through it.
Yep, no problem. So let's just share screen. Okay, so what I'm going to be showing today is a Node.js and JavaScript based application. And this application is really going to render some of the content pages, I suppose you would call them, for my site. So here I've got a home page with a title, description, we've got a hero image and a latest news widget, which we'll come back to a bit later. And then what we also have is more of a content page. So where you've got a title, description, and then some body text. So if I just jump over now and show the code, which you may have seen a second ago. So we're using Express.js to sort of handle the routing for us, and we're listening for any route. One thing to say that we will do with blocks is we will actually do the lookup in site view for you based on the path that someone enters, and if there is a node that matches that path, we'll get that node for you and feeds information from that node into a block. So I can pick up things like the version status and the entry ID, for example, if there is one attached to the node. I can then feed that into a delivery API query. And if I get an entry back successfully, I can then start to feed that entry into my liquid templates as we're using today. So in terms of which template to use, that decision will be taken based on the content type ID, and then we'll feed in information such as the title, description, and body copy. So this is my homepage template. As Rich mentioned, it's written in Liquid today, but again, it could be any templating language you choose. So here I've got the title, the description, and then here we're displaying the news. And we've got more of a content template here where we've got the title, description, and body copy. Now, up until this point, I've been working locally and developing and testing this app, but now I'm actually ready to push my code to Contentis and create a block. So to do that, I'm going to go into my GitLab CI file. Now, this first stage here, this latest build, this builds my Docker container. I mean, if I just uncomment these few lines here, well, these lines of config will do is they will actually take that Docker container, push it to Contensis, and create a block. So if I just say push to Contensis, and I can commit that change and then push it to my source control. Now, in terms of the config, what we will do from a documentation point of view is sort of give you some examples and some boilerplate config. So all you'll really need to do is just change a couple of variables. So things like the CMS alias, project, and actually the name of your block. And if I just jump over to CI, you can see previously that I only had this one stage, which is latest build, but now it's actually built the Docker container, and now it's pushing it to Contensis, and it's not actually worked for some reason, as is usually the case with live demos. So let me just jump in actually and have a quick look. Okay, let me just rerun it for a second. Let's just see if there was a temporary blip there.
Did you delete and recreate your Git project before the demo, John? Have you put your secret back in?
Thank you. So what I will do just for a second is I will just have to turn off screen share probably actually. And
if you just take the secret from the CMS, John, and just put it into your CI.
Whereabouts is it in the CMS?
So in the API key. So the block CI API key, shared secret. So I think you're getting a 401, which means you're not authorized.
Yep. Yes.
It's obviously all part of the demo.
Okay. Oh yeah.
So it gives you nice messages back to say that you didn't provide the secret correctly.
And that was me trying to be clever and keep it secret. There we go. So hopefully it will be a third time is the charm. Fortunately, we've done a lot of work to optimize the builds, so this should actually happen fairly quickly. I'm hoping in maybe less than a minute, or certainly hopefully not much longer.
There we go.
That's not pushing, so let's actually just watch that go through.
So the bad news is if it does go terribly wrong, we haven't got a backup video or anything. So, hey, there we go.
There we go. So now that I've successfully pushed a block, I'm going to pass you back over to Rich, who's sort of going to come into the web manager here and show you how you would release that block through the Contensis UI.
Great. So yeah, so I'm going to be starting, I guess, a little bit from scratch here. So you can see I've got a completely blank project. I have got some entries in here. So I've got 3 little entries, one for an about page, one for a home page, and one for some news that I'm hoping Simon's going to build me a template for a little bit later on in the demo. So if we have a look at these are just fairly standard content pages. We've got you know, a title, a description, and body copy, and probably the same for a home page. It's a title and description, and this news article's just got some fairly simple content on here as well. So very straightforward content there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into site view, and what I want to do is I want to add some existing entries. So I'm going to add the about content to this tree, and you can see now I've got the about node added here. and I'm going to perhaps attach an existing entry for the home page. So that's going to attach the existing entry for the root of the home. I'm going to create another node here. So I'm going to create a news area where we're going to put some news content. And again, under here, I want to add an existing entry, and I'm going to create this Contensis block using .NET down in here. So as we can see, this is all in here. Now, the interesting thing to bear in mind, I guess, is that with all of these areas here, you haven't specified how you want any of this content to render, what template we want to use, all those sorts of things. And that's really what we're going to be looking at in a second. So if we drop across here into renderers, then you can see that we've now got a render in here called content pages. So this was auto-generated. So this is, as I was talking about, sort of convention over configuration. We automatically generate for you a renderer. And you can think of a renderer basically like a template selection. So what we can do with a renderer at the moment is we can say, it's this block, and I can assign, let's say, homepage content type and content type to it. And if I do that, this renderer, and then in turn this block, will be used to render content types of content or homepage. So I'm basically saying that I want those content types to be rendered using John's block that he's just pushed into us. So if I save that, then we can then move on. And if we have a look in the site view tree here, another way of doing that, just to explain it, so we've attached it at a renderer level. You could choose, if you wanted to, for example, override a renderer here and pick a specific one at a specific node level. We're not going to be covering that today. We don't really need to in that sense. We've got a fairly simple site, a fairly simple scenario. So if I go into the blocks area here and click on content pages, you can see that this is my content pages block. I'm in the master branch here, if you're interested in that sort of thing. And we're on version 1, and it's telling me it's available. So what that means ultimately is that we've taken the Docker container that John's given us. We've sniffed it, inspected it, and discovered it, if you like, to see what's in there. And we've then booted it in the infrastructure in 3 data centers, and we've made resilient pairs of those available. So we've got lots of instances of that running. From here, if we want to, we can go and have a look at a specific commit ID, so we can see what has happened with this particular change. And a little later on, I'll show you going into the versions where we can see diffs and between versions and all those sorts of things as well. Just at a high level, as this sort of web manager role, I can see that John's really done very little here. He's just added the secret, which he hadn't added earlier, so we've got that in there now. It's great. We can see he's done it. One thing I mentioned earlier was this idea of releasing, and you can see it's already been released. And this is because we've chosen, when we push this block, to do an auto release. So whenever we push it, it just releases it, makes it available straight away. Now, what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to quickly make this live. This is not used anywhere yet, so I'm going to make this live because it's not used anywhere. It doesn't really matter, just so that I can start to look at this content on preview. I could also look at content on things like the staging as well, but as soon as I've done this, you can see it's gone from just staging to these 2 other sites or URLs I can see things on. So with blocks, we have introduced a new concept for URLs, which is staging. So where you have live-yourproject.cloud.contensis.com, you also now have a staging. And what that does is it effectively shows you the live version of the content with the to be released blocks. So you can see what your system's going to look like the moment you make something live. So if I come across here into site view and I perhaps have a look at the about node, I can then click in here, preview, and I can see the page. So I've now hooked up the about with the template, so to speak, which is in the block. And if I go back to the root here, I can see here's my home page, and I've got a piece of latest news in here as well. So that's all looking really good. I'm happy with that. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to hand over to Sai, who can hopefully show us how we can build a block using slightly different technique.
I think we're going to go to John, weren't we, to run through Cypress first, maybe?
Yeah, we can do that. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, go for it, John.
Yep. Okay, no problem. So yeah, what I'm just going to show is just show Cypress and also just making a quick change to the block that we've just pushed. So I'm just going to quickly update the color of the title here just to show you how that process would work once you have got a live block. So I haven't actually got live or hot reloading set up in this particular application. So if I just refresh, you can see here, but the title is now changed. So yes, Rich mentioned that we use Cypress quite heavily, or started to use it, I would say. It's probably better to say. So if I just uncomment this config here, this is for running my Cypress tests. And as Rich showed you earlier in his diagram, I'm just going to put that in between building my container and pushing to Contensis. So but I should, in theory, only push working code to my block. So just while I commit this here, we've started using Cypress internally as a testing framework. So if I just commit and push, mainly because it allows us to test the site as if we were a real user. So clicking through the buttons. So for example, on Contensis.com, we use it quite heavily for key user journeys. So things like, can I raise a help desk ticket successfully? And what we can also do is actually run the tests locally ourselves, either through the command line or using a little UI tool that Cypress gives you. So that's just going to load up here. Now, what this will do is it will load up a list of tests. In our case, we've just got one simple test, but you can have multiple tests. I think we've got about 6 or 8 running for Contensis.com for various things. And this is just a simple little test. All it really does is it just simply checks that we've got a logo there. And if I just jump back over here a second to my code, just to show you the test, it's really only a few lines of code, just to say, navigate to the home page, find the logo, and check the source. That was just to show you that, really give you a brief overview. I'm just going to pass you back over to Rich, who will just quickly show you the Cypress dashboard and maybe talk a little bit about how you could potentially make that change live.
So as you can see now, I've gone into the GitLab pipeline, which is where John was a little bit. If I click onto here, you can see now rather than 2 stages, build, push to Contensis, we now have build, test, push to Contensis. And if I click on the test one here, we can go in and we can see that everything looks good. Now, obviously for developers, that's useful who are working with source control. They'll get emails if there's a failure in their pipeline, they can go and have a look at it and all those sorts of things. But if you do want to use the UI that Cypress provide, they've got quite a nice UI in here. As you can see, here's our account, and we're in the introducing blocks area. And you can see 1 minute ago, we did the color change and UI test. So I can click into here and I can see that it passed. If you have flaky tests or failing tests, they'll appear in here. But again, as a web manager, I can go in here and I can understand whether there's new tests been added, how often they've worked in the past, all those sorts of things to be really sure about what's going on. And the other great thing is they help you actually spot issues. So we've been able to fix a number of issues that were intermittently happening in our site as a result of this framework, because what you can do is go into here, not only see that it passed and the fact that it was running on Linux, whatever it might be. But you can actually go in and watch the video of the actual test, so we can see precisely what happened and what was done in that browser during that test. And you've got the browser bar and everything there to see what happened. So really useful. In terms of Cypress, I think they offer 3 users for free and about 500 tests a month or something along those lines if you want to use it for free. They of course have paid for accounts as well, but you don't have to use that. You can literally use the output from here. That's what you need. The others are nice to have, and we feel it's nice to have for what we're doing. So if I come back into Contensis again, then John changed the title. Just to have a quick look at that, you can see that we've still got the dark title up here already. So I can go back into my blocks here, and I can see that I've got content pages, and inside here I've got a new item turn up. So I can see that color change and UI test. Again, I could go and have a look at the source code if I wanted to. Just to show another feature, I could dig into the details of this version and find out much more about it, and I can do things like diffing between the different versions. So let's say we'd had 3 or 4 new commits, we could actually look at the difference between what's live and what's about to be live if we want to make it live, and those sorts of things as well. Just to get a feel for it, I can change my URL here to staging, and on staging I can see that I've got my new title, and if I go to live, we should still be on the dark title that we had before. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to pop into here and I'm going to make this new version live. I'm going to click yes to do that, and you can see that that new version has been made live. The little ticks come up down here, and if I come across to here and refresh, then just in I think it's probably under a second, around that time, we've actually switched that out with the routing to point all the new requests to the live version of the block. There's no downtime during that process. It's a straight sort of atomic switch over to the new version, because the old and the new are running side by side, ready to go. The other thing that I might do is I might go, well, yeah, that isn't exactly what I wanted, and I want to change that back. And in that case, what I can do is go, whoa, hold on a sec, let's mark this as broken. And you can see it's now been marked as broken. And we're going to then drop across over to the other one, and back there we are. We're back to the dark version, the title, and our change has been reverted. And bear in mind that you could be using a block for all of your templates for your whole site. You could be using it for sections of your site. It really depends how you want to approach things. But ultimately, the ability to switch this out really quickly and roll back quickly and easily gives development teams a lot of confidence when they're working, especially if they're following sort of agile principles and gradually iterating and those sorts of things as well. And finally, I think it's just worth mentioning for anyone that's interested, when we do these switches, we also invalidate the varnish caching as well. So if you have lots of content that uses this particular renderer and block, then the moment that one is changed, it will invalidate the varnish cache for that as well. So the changes are literally instantaneous as you release them. So yeah, so that's great. As I said before, I'd like some news in my site now. So if I come into here, I've got my news article. We've got no way of rendering it yet. So I'm going to hand over to Cy, who can hopefully get that rendered for us now.
Thanks, Rich. Right, let me just share my screen. So share that screen here. So yeah, so as Rich said, so it's going to be very similar in principle to the way that John approached it using JavaScript. But what we're going to be doing is rendering news using .NET Core. So we've got our news article here, and whilst Rich was just talking you through that, I actually committed the first version of a block. And as Rich said before, with each block, automatically gets created a renderer. So if we look here, I've got my news record renderer, which has been created for the block. And simply, again, all I'm going to say is I want my news renderer to render my news. So if we come back here now and come to entries and click on the entry and click preview, we can now see that my news is now rendering using my block. So looking at this works just like any other entry. We can obviously make changes. So if I'm not particularly happy with this content, I can just drop back in here and use some pre-prepared content that I've got here. Have a look at that. So save and preview, and we can see our content change. And I can also see here actually that one thing that this is missing, which is probably pretty important for a news article, is its publish date. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through how I go about adding this publish date. So if we drop back into VS Code, you can obviously use Visual Studio, VS Code, whichever tool you want. I happen to use in VS Code. And this is just a really straightforward, simple Razor pages example. So what I've got here is I've got a single Razor page, which is my index page, and it looks pretty similar to what John was doing, but in effect, it's plain HTML, making reference to things like fav icons and CSS. The CSS in this particular case, I've actually put into a static folder here, so this actually gets pushed with the block. There are alternative ways in which you could do that, so you could actually have a shared block that you could put all of these types of resources in and then share them across multiple blocks. And we'll cover that in a later webinar in the series. But at the moment, we're just keeping it straightforward and keeping it local. So yeah, it continues on with straight HTML. And then all I'm doing there is decorating this HTML and getting properties from the entry. And this entry is actually hooked up through the code behind file. So if we had a quick look at this code behind, this is quite straightforward in that, like John said, every block, when it's rendered from a node, so when it gets passed to you, the request, you are actually given the entry ID and the node ID. In this case, I don't need to do anything with the node, so I'm just getting the entry ID of the query string here, setting the entry ID, calling the .NET delivery client, and getting the entry here. And it's as simple as that. And as soon as I've done that, within my Razor page, I can obviously use any property from that entry. So we want you to add the publish date. What we'll do is we'll add it under strapline. So if we literally just paste that there, I happen to know that the field is called article date. And if we just restart here, we'll be able to see that locally. So that's just building, and we can bring that up. So we can see we've got our publish date there. It's not a particularly nice looking publish date, so maybe we want to make some changes there. Maybe we'll drop some text in front of it, published on, and we'll maybe format it a bit nicer. Let's just string that. So let's put the month out, the day, and maybe the year. And let's just save that and restart this and have a look, check whether we're happy with that. So yeah, I think we'd agree that looks much better. So that's our change actually made locally and tested locally. So the next stage is, as John did, is to push the code. So if we go into the source code, we can add a publish date. If I can type. And what we'll do is we'll just commit that and push that. Now I happen to be using GitHub here. And that's really just to show you guys that there's no sort of need to use one particular Git provider. So just like GitLab, GitHub has its own version of CI. So GitLab has pipelines. GitHub has workflow actions. But very similarly, nowadays, all CI is pretty much configuration in code. So you get a GitHub, you get a workflow action, and it's doing the same things. It's building the Docker image, and then it's got to push to Contensis stage. And there's only a few little differences here between mine and John's. Mine works, no, I'm only joking, John. So we've got an alias, which is obviously our URL for Contensis, so your instance name. You set in the project, same as John's, and I've chosen to call my block news record. But also what I have done is I've changed my source provider to GitHub, whereas John's was GitLab. And that's so that all these URLs that we're generating in Contensis, we know where to point them for things like comparisons and for commit messages and things. At the moment, out the box, we support GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket, both the self-hosted on-prem versions and enterprise versions and the cloud versions. So for go live, they'll be the supported GitHub providers. And potentially we may look at supporting others, but they're the major three. So we obviously pushed that code a few minutes ago. If I drop into GitHub now, so what we'll have a look at is the similar thing as pipelines, but in GitHub. So you can see here that my add a publish date is currently building and it's pushed. It's just not very good at updating the UI. So there we go. So that's now pushed. So we can come back into Contensis now and drop into blocks. Go to news record. As you can see, it tells me that there's a new update. I can drop in here, and that is just starting at the moment. And just like through the same as GitLab, you can go to the commit. So I can click on the commit, have a look. I can see, oh, right, yeah, size pushed, the article date formatted. And then I might want to have a look at that on staging. So I could view on staging, click through to the news article. We can see that my date's there. And as Rich was sharing earlier, so obviously that hasn't gone to my live site yet because I haven't said that I want to make that live. So as a site owner, I can come in and say, yep, I'm happy with that on staging. Right, I want to come and I want to make that live. So I can make that live, confirm the make live, and then literally view on live site, go to my news article, and I can see my change there. So that's a sort of a very simple razor pages example, but as you can see, it's rendering my news article, all the routing's taken care of. Just to make a point of how that routing's working, so that's being pushed through to my block, and because that's a catch-all, so everything's hitting this index, and that's why it's rendering. But yeah, I think that covers news. I hope that's okay, Rich. So if I hand back over to you, you can maybe run through the final bits.
Great, thanks, Si. So yeah, let me share my screen again, and I'm just going to drop over into the presentation we had a little bit earlier. So just to sort of recap, I guess, on what we were looking at earlier, you've seen in different languages committing the code to a source code provider, a source control. We don't really mind what that is. It's really up to you what you do. We then build the Docker container, test it if you want to. Si wasn't testing in his case, but of course he could have easily integrated Cypress testing on top of the GitLab action he had in there as well. And then we push it to Contensis and ultimately make the bug live. And then often we'll start this cycle again and we go round in a sort of circle as we generally move our site and our code forward in that sense. In terms of what we're looking to do in terms of release, we're aiming to be released within the next release cycle, which for us is around 12 weeks. And it's certainly feasible to have access to blocks early if you want to. So because we've introduced this new staging URL, you can actually have sort of block access in your CMS, where you could actually have it today in effect, but we wouldn't want to do that until we've done a few more things. So anyone who's interested in getting involved in that, then let us know, and we'd love to take you up on the offer, get your blocks booted, and lots of people on this call will already have Docker containers that they can boot and use for their site. So you'd be able to do that early if you wanted to as well, and then obviously take advantage of things and go live after the new release. The reason that it's not ready to go yet, I guess, is because of some sort of key features and stories that we'd still like to add and we'd like to finish off. So one of those is reverse proxies. So this is a feature which allows us to effectively hook in content coming from an entirely different endpoint. So many of our customers may have perhaps a third party producing a small section of their site, perhaps a virtual tour of a property or a campus or something like that, and they want /virtual tours to go off to this provider, some sort of SaaS provider. So reverse proxy allows us to go /XYZ, goes off to this third party. And the other great thing about reverse proxies is they enable us to easily migrate across from a previous solution to Contensis. So if you've got a website that exists already, you can set a reverse proxy on the root of site view and set it to your old site address. Whether it's Contensis or not makes no difference. And you can then start serving that site using this. So if it doesn't hit a site view node, it'll drop back to the old site. So you can start this gradual iterative migration. And we'll be talking about that at another point. So reverse proxies are another key one for us. And finally, the other key one for this release would be exposing logs for developers so that you can see that our blocks started up nicely and properly, which I would expect because we had a test in there. So ultimately we booted them in CI before we even tried to boot them in Contensis. But getting the logs out of the solution is really useful as well. So we'd like to make that available for blocks too, and that's something that's really important to us. The sort of another feature we'd like to touch on moving forward would be the sharing of blocks. And ultimately, as you've seen today, blocks are no more really than a Docker registry URL and some config. So there's nothing stopping anyone sharing a block today. They can just give somebody a URL of a Docker endpoint and push that to Contensis, and it'll start in their instance and do whatever it does. So there's nothing stopping that happening, but we aim in the future to make a more collaborative experience for doing that. That might be as simple as a GitHub page with a list of great blocks, or it might be something more, but that's something we're sort of thinking about and going to be working on in the future. Some great examples we've already got. We've already developed a new forms backend block. We've developed a completely generic MailChimp integration, which hooks into these new forms, as an example, on webhooks. And we also developed a sitemap block so that it will just literally generate a sitemap from your site view tree automatically. So you don't have to boil all of that code into your normal template logic or whatever else. It can just happen there and then. So those are just 3 simple examples. And of course, there'll be lots more to sort of come in the future. As I alluded to earlier, we're going to be doing some future webinars, which we're going to announce very soon. I think the topic of the next webinar will be all about migrating from existing sites, so that you can see how you can do that and how you can move over to blocks if you're not using it already, even in a really minor way, and sort of taking you through some of those journeys. So I think we've covered everything we sort of intended to.